Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to engage in some chatter about open online courses with this audience here. Particularly want to say thank you to David Wiley and the organizing crew for the generous invitation to be here. I'd also like to give a shout out to David, obviously, for his leadership of and stewardship of the open education movement as a whole. Celebrating 10 years is a notable activity and what's probably one of the more significant trends in higher education. And to have a community develop around that over a cycle of 10 years, I hope David at least recognizes the significance of that achievement, and I certainly hope that as a group and audience as well, we're aware of the effort that's required to make something like this happen. And it's not just money and glory that David's doing it for. So I'm going to get started here to talk about a slightly different view of MOOCs than what was presented by the previous speaker. If you're interested in the slides, you can access them on SlideShare, and the citations that I'm referencing will be listed in the footnotes or in the pain section of those slides. So basically, I'm going to do one of these four-part run-throughs around MOOCs, and I'll talk about the sort of how I got here. So this is sort of personal reflections on how did I end up where I am right now. I want to also look at what's the state of MOOC research as a whole, and then I'm going to go into a bit of an angst-filled reflection, and then hopefully end up with a little bit of hope on what each of us in this room can do to create or contribute to a future that gives us the values, or that reflects the values that I think we as educators share around learner autonomy, learner control, learner creativity. So first, a little bit of history. So I started blogging, I guess it was probably late 90s, early 2000. At that point, I was blogging on Blogger, and there was about a few other folks. The main people I followed at that time, there's a gentleman by the name of David Carter, or something like that, some combination of those three names, and Stephen Downes, who some of you may have heard of, and Will Richardson were the main folks that I connected with at that time. And I was pretty comfortable, 2001, 2002, that I was reading every single education blog that was being written at that time. And one of the things that I found most satisfying about the experience of blogging was that in my own system, I was at Red River College at the time, which is a college in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I found that the things that I was interested in, I wasn't able to talk about with folks within that system. But suddenly online, I found this group of folks who were creative and innovative. They could move from an idea to code in a day, and it was fascinating. It was a very lively, motivational type of project where it wasn't just that I was sharing, but that I was learning enormously. And it was almost this, it's not that we were teaching one another explicitly, but we were walking in parallel knowledge tracks, amplifying each other's awareness and understanding. So in 2002, I decided, because I'd been teaching at the college for a while, I decided I'd like to sort of change this notion of what does it mean to learn and interact with content. Most systems assume that you need content, then you learn the content, then you get accredited. And so my thinking was, what if content isn't the starting point of learning? What if we start to treat content as a byproduct of the learning experience? So we start first with interaction, then produce content or articles or resources as a byproduct. And that's essentially what I did with this course in 2002. Just an open online course. Each week I fire off a quick topic to a group of people that wanted to be involved, and then we would discuss it for the week, and at the end of the week I would pull together an article based on the nature of those interactions and resources shared. Again, I was just trying to tease out this notion of what is it that's critical in learning. And it's not that we necessarily need to say this is most important here, but it's just challenging this assumption that in order to learn, we need curriculum first, versus this notion that this is a byproduct of learning experience. In 2003, a few folks, some of you may be in the room that were involved with this as well, and Stephen Downes and I started with this idea of open education. Now, David Wiley had been at this for a while. I still remember the blog post where Stephen called David out for not being open, and David was highly perplexed. And so, and thus started a beautiful relationship. And so our interest, or my interest at least with this, was that we wanted to advance discussion around opening up parts of the education process in such a way that it was community-oriented. It enabled this iterative, progressive development of ideas and knowledge that I had experienced just in my own use of blogs and learning. And so that was our goal. We looked at Distributed Learning Object Repository Network. There was a time where that would have been a cool acronym. And essentially, we wanted to engage a broader group of students so that we would allow an open platform, an open system of learning. And so we had the lovely website where we were targeting this, had a few meetings. This lasted about 6 months, and everybody got randomly bored. And so things sort of went away, but this general idea of being open and learning together and creating content together and doing that in a way that was distributed, not owned by a set system, has really been a trend in just my own thinking and development of my own views of what teaching and learning is. Somewhere along the line, there was some development with a group of academics, and this is why it gets so satisfying when you start to see these iterative cyclical developments of ideas. Because what happens is someone starts with something, and a really well-developed idea can't be untangled from the variety of factors that contribute to its origin. So when we talk about MOOCs, and we talk about openness in education, it didn't start 2 years ago. And online learning didn't start 2 years ago. So a good idea is one where someone can't say, oh, that was Stanford. A good idea is one where you've got to tease apart a mess of different narratives because it means that a lot of different people contributed to its development. And so David Wiley had been running a series of open courses, and one of them, he's got a series of bullet points on what this was in this blog post, but basically what struck with me is this notion of running everything in the open, that the experience was fully available and accessible to anybody who randomly cared. There were no restrictions to joining, but it wasn't just a free as in cost, it was a free as an ability to reuse as well. A few other folks, Alec Koros being one, were playing around with this idea at a similar time, just opening up grad course and seeing what would happen. Together with Stephen Downs, we offered an open online course as well in 2008 where we were looking at network learning. And shortly after we ran that course in 2010, an individual that some of you may recall from your event. By the way, your keynote presenters last year are all bastards, because I was looking at the tweets and the blog posts, and they're singing on barges and doing all kinds of fun stuff. And, we're really going to lower your keynote standards this year. So I just want to make sure that you're clear of that up front. So then Jim Groom went out and with Alan Levine and a few others initiated DS 106, which has since come to represent a very just a great illustration of content being a byproduct of learning, of artifact generation not being the prerequisite to a quality learning experience. And so the big narrative I'm trying to get at around here is that openness and transparency that was happening with these different folks playing with ideas and sharing those ideas publicly helped to produce a lot of early innovation, and it was fascinating to see how one person would take a MOOC idea and spin it in a completely different direction than what someone else had done and share that openly and encourage others to adopt a similar approach. And much of our interest, much of my interest at least, was to push back to this notion of education being an institutionally controlled approach, this notion of monolithic technological elements being in part of that experience, and the transmission pedagogies that were at that point already starting to dominate the transition to online. Because I viewed and still do that everything we're doing with online learning is actually seems to be largely adopting the worst pedagogies of classroom practice, but just hardening them in an online environment where even the little control that learners used to have in a classroom for socialization and interaction is now eliminated, as we have a very sanitized process through which we, by the way, if you've seen Pink Floyd The Wall, you know which scene I'm referring to, where they all fall on the conveyor belt into the big meat grinder. So it's that kind of a process that I was sort of pushing against. And just a simple example, and this is touching on this point again, is that a sufficiently developed idea should be inseparable from the context in which it arose, and it should not be linked to a single individual because no one contributes that much to the development of a knowledge landscape. It's iterative, it's communal, it's network. So the steam engine, for example, this is Rocket. If you look at Rocket and you pull back at who contributed to it, you can't say, well, so-and-so invented the steam engine, because they really didn't. It was thousands of people that went back for hundreds of years that contributed to the development of various parts of the steam engine that were eventually configured into what was known as Rocket. So this is what happens in a learning or a knowledge building process, is so many people are involved that you can't tease things apart. So you have these numerous strands that really go from the beginning of the modern world that ended up producing or generating the steam engine. And it's a process that is really less about creating something from ground zero and more about stitching together knowledge that has come across a variety of spaces. I'm just going to pause at that now because I want to touch back on that a little bit later on in the talk. So when we talk about this in educational context, we need something that is more open. We need something that is more accessible, flexible. We can build it, we can rebuild it, we can mess around with it, and not just with the content, but with the pedagogy, and not just the pedagogy, but with the actual learning systems. And this is where my angst around the Mooc providers starts to become a little more pronounced. So if you look at the Mooc Maps, and you've seen probably some version of this. So in April 2012, there were roughly 3 systems associated with MOOCs, and those were all Coursera related. If you look at this now, and there's a lot that are missing here. There's sort of smaller boutique type MOOC providers and Vegica out of Brazil and other systems that aren't reflected here. But suddenly it's like MOOCs vomited over the world. And in a 2-year period of time, which is stunning. And so the trends were so rapid and so significant, a lot of educators initially ignored what was happening with MOOCs and sort of picked up the conversation once it was a little late. And the conversation had moved from an academic practice to now being a corporate or being an enterprise practice that was backed by venture capital. Now, in fairness, it's worth looking back a little bit and saying, well, you know, this whole learning online stuff and these MOOCs, they're not as new as we like to think they are. You know, for example, going back to 1833, where you could learn composition through post, or through Anna Elliott Tickner, where her work on the Society to Encourage Studies at Home back in 1873, at a masser scale, I think masser is a word, isn't it? At a more mass scale. The University of the Air, which is a Canadian initiative that ran on just public TV, or made it available on CTV, or where you could learn degree-level courses, university partnerships. I mean, it sounds a lot like MOOCs today, but this was running 40-plus years ago. Continental Classroom had a similar experience out in the U.S., where you would use dead air time in the morning at 6 a.m. and you could learn physics. So this whole MOOC thing isn't quite as new as we want it to be, but that's a little bit of a background. I just want to give you a bit of an introduction on where I come from in my thinking about MOOCs and what my original goals and interests were in this open education space, but also more broadly to recognize that what we're calling MOOCs now, people have been thinking about making education available to the masses for a long time, and we do ourselves a disservice by ignoring those legacy activities and thinking that everything that needs to be learned can be learned just by doing it ourselves, rather than stitching together, as with Rocket or the steam engine, but stitching together the knowledge that's been developed by many communities. So the current state of MOOCs. Why do we have MOOCs now? Well, I think broadly it's a complex question. It's not as simple as we'd like it to be, and the narrative isn't as concise as is probably desired. The most dominant aspect, I believe, is that MOOCs are essentially a supply-side answer to decades-long demand-side increases in learning needs. And the university sector has been delayed in responding to this growing proliferation or the growing presence of learning needs in society. The universities have largely stayed focused on sequential or traditional students. Yes, they've got continuing education or faculty of extensions, but overall they stayed sort of like universities were. And yet we moved into a knowledge economy somewhere along the line, where we now have, in developed regions of the world, only 15% of the economy is traditional employment or traditional labor. The 85% in the US context, smaller in other parts of the world, 75% Germany and so on. But even then, the majority of economies like China now fits into something that we would call a knowledge economy, that are people who work with ideas rather than welding together physical objects. And that's a big change. So while this change happened, while society itself structurally reoriented itself to a knowledge-based model, we did not have the similar corresponding reorganization with higher education. But it wasn't just society as a whole, it was also the growing change of student populations. US, for example, as of today, the larger or the majority of students are no longer traditional higher education students. They're part-time students or taking university studies outside of a regular student model. So we have a different type of a student. We have a different number or range of students that are entering higher education now. Since 1995, where the OECD average for students entering university was around 40% of the population of that group. Today we're at 60%. That requires a completely different range of technical support services, pedagogical support, emotional support. When we have 20% of society attending higher education, you can assume largely that they'll be self-motivated individuals. When you bump that up to 30, 40, 50%, suddenly you have a totally different range or profile of student. They need different supports, they need different guidance. These aren't individuals who are necessarily self-regulated learners the way that your 10, 20% of the population is. And the profile of student is more than just the number of people who are obtaining an education. It's also the profile of the makeup of individuals that are entering that education landscape. Increasingly favoring females. The age of entrance is increasing. In some areas, it's now 24 years of age is the entrance age for entering into higher education versus 18 or 19 years of age previously. Top countries now, China and India. So there's a very different model of education that we're starting to see from both students and from the system itself. So MOOCs then are largely a supply-side answer to these demands, to these fundamental economic shifts, societal shifts, and shifts of student profile. The previous speaker referenced that with Coursera, for example, the vast majority of their students already have a bachelor's degree. They're not taking MOOCs necessarily to get a bachelor's degree. They're taking MOOCs to scratch some kind of a knowledge itch. So we ran recently with the generous support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They were running a fairly large grant that will hopefully help to give us a better understanding of the research around MOOCs. I think most of us could probably assert that MOOCs are perhaps just a little bit overhyped. And so as a result of that slight overhypage, most of that is also driven by just random nonsensical statements and anecdotal views on what MOOCs will do. I mean, the statement that by 2050 we're going to have 10 universities. Like, who does that unless you're like the mayor of Toronto? See what I did there? So those kinds of statements are just nonsensical. And so, but we hear them, and you know what? Media prints them, and people say, yes, that's what it is. And even worse, people who make decisions, and governors and leaders, take those ideas seriously, and all of a sudden, in the absence of any evidence, we have a foundation-less revolution that's going to change the world and make everybody happier. So one of the big benefits of this particular initiative was to really get a sense at what is happening with MOOCs. Right? Not what's the hype around it, but what are people actually doing and who's contributing to research around MOOCs. So higher education is, I'm going to posit without being, I was at an event recently where Newton organized a get-together and Clayton Christensen was one of our speakers. It was a small group, about 15, 20 of us there. And everybody was hating on universities, and I said, I'm going to go 100% against the grain here because I think in the future we are going to have more universities, not less universities. We're expecting to more than double higher education enrollment. Now, we may have a few universities that'll close in developed parts of the world, Canada, US, Europe, and other regions that have a developed system that faces economic pressures, but globally, universities will increase in number in the next decade. We're not going to have this fatalistic implosion. And the reason that that'll happen is because we're expecting to more than double the number of students entering higher education internationally in the next 5 to 10 years. So even if you do a lot of that with online learning, you're still going to have a big factor at play. Now I see a few questions or just people who like to raise their hands occasionally. So I'm going to pause later on, and I'll run through this stuff quickly because I do want to spend time for questions. So give me about another 15 minutes to run through random things, and then we can chat if that's okay. So we did with the Gates Foundation grant. We solicited short proposals. We had initially we had, where am I here? 266 submissions, 37 countries, US, Canada, China, UK, Spain were our top submitters. From there, we narrowed it down to 78 submissions. I did make a few enemies, I'm sure, in this process of narrowing it down, but because a lot of folks who had very worthwhile projects weren't funded, but unfortunately we did have limited dollars, and so we had to make some very difficult choices. In the end, we ended up with a submission rate or total acceptance of 28 grantees. And one of the things that was interesting, by the way, how many of you seen that parody of the TEDx report? Or the TEDx talk. Oh, it's just awesome. I was going to say at this slide, I was going to say we looked at the data. But anyways, if you get a chance, it's quite amusing, actually. So we looked at the data. And so what we found was that in the future, video games will be more realistic. No, but what we found was that the vast majority of research activity, and you might not be able to see this clearly, but I'll just try to emphasize with this. So basically this is what were the methodologies by which academic sector. So in the slides, you'll be able to see this clearer on the slides if you want to download those. But basically looking at the different academic domains from education, engineering, computer science, and so on, where were the researchers coming from that were asking questions about MOOCs? And first of all, we found they were quite broad. We had individuals. MOOCs are a cross-university area of interest, which is perhaps one of the reasons why there's so much hype around it. The prominent field, though, was certainly education, and the prominent research methodology was a mixed methodology, even though the second one was quantitative research activities. So it's not that MOOCs are this fuzzy concept that are being played with in media. There's some good quality research and some very well-established researchers asking important questions around what role do these activities play within society and how can they be better evaluated. We also looked at a range of, what are the most cited authors? Who was the most prominent in the research literature, and were the studies citing them either mixed, qualitative, or quantitative, like what was driving the MOOC conversation? Because we felt if we could better understand the MOOC research landscape, we would have a better understanding of where are things trending, because we couldn't separate a lot of the hype around what MOOCs were supposed to do from what was actually happening on the part of researchers. One of the most surprising aspects, though, was which field was most represented. And in 90% of the submissions, we had an education faculty involved in the conversation, which surprised me. I thought, especially since computer science and related fields are the ones that are driving a lot of the MOOC activity, I thought that education would be largely a peripheral focal point. But it wasn't. Education was well represented, and almost every submission that we had an educational co-author or someone involved in that sector. So it's a more sophisticated analysis of what's happening around, at least how academics are thinking about MOOCs. In our final selection, we had 12 Coursera submissions that used Coursera data, and then edX, and some that used a variety of them. Biggest country of submission, this was interesting, we had, in spite of strong submissions from China, we didn't have any successful candidates that came out of that area. But we had a total of 28 institutions that were focused. Now, this isn't very groundbreaking data, but the big insight that I got out of it was the quality of the research that's being utilized. The focus on quantitative and qualitative methodology was evenly split, but mixed methods were preferred, and the prevalence of what I would like to see in education research, namely academics who have educational orientation. So those were quite interesting outcomes from that end. We'll get on this a little later on. Anyway, so a bit of angst. Here's what worries me about MOOCs. First of all, biggest thing that worries me about MOOCs is that MOOCs actually don't prepare learners to do the kinds of things that learners need to be prepared for. We would ideally, I think, want in a complex knowledge landscape where we have a variety of growing trends and challenges, create a learner or foster the development of a learner who is able to take on very large, big visions. If I was, by the way, here's my definition of big data. Big data is anything bigger than the amount of crap and hype that comes out of Silicon Valley. So that's just the formal definition of big data. But so when you get a lot of these initiatives are certainly coming out of, these moonshots that come out of, Google and other initiatives. They're fascinating because they're dreaming big about big problems. And I think educationally we need a system that generates learners that dream big about societal problems, not about how to optimize learners to click a certain button over another button. So MOOCs should really do, in my eyes, two big things. One, they should respond to the context that I addressed earlier, that the growing learning needs of society that universities aren't attending to. But secondly, they should prepare learners for complex knowledge activities that they face in our society today. And MOOCs currently do A, but they kind of suck at B. So essentially, we're not getting the type of learning that we need through the prominent MOOC models that we have today. Second thing, this should probably be relevant or at least of interest to most individuals in the room here, but openness is being lost in the conversation. And it's a challenge because on the one hand, I know it's fun to be cool and above the fray of petty MOOC hype, but at the end of the day, it is driving a lot of trends, and as cool as everyone in this room is, it's something we have to respond to, and we particularly have to respond to, I saw there's a bit of critical commentary on the Mooc channel during the previous speaker. And one of the realities is that he wasn't really speaking to us. Andrew was speaking to the people that are taking Coursera MOOCs that aren't us, and they don't care about openness to the same level that we do. They care about ease of access, they care about a system that works well, and that's what they're giving them. So we might feel slighted that we have a higher ideal, but the point is, until we make our higher ideal of openness tangible and accessible and easy to get a hold of in the systems that they're engaged with in a way that Coursera does, we will lose to that kind of a model every day. So what happened between what we had initially with the ideals of MIT, where it would be these open curricular materials available for free of charge, and then all of a sudden we end up here where we have edX basically reserving all copyrights and Coursera taking a similar approach. Or what happened between here, this is Open University's Open Learn initiative out of UK, where all educational content would be reused and made available to Creative Commons, and then all of a sudden we end up here, where suddenly we have Future Learn that has this goal of protecting their content to the fullest extent possible. Fascinating. I mean, these aren't that we had a transition shift where a different group of people started participating in MOOCs that didn't share the openness ideal. I mean, these are the same people that 3-4 years ago were saying open, 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 and all of a sudden they're saying, oh, maybe we can make money on this, closed, 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 or something. I don't know what happened, and it perplexes me why that has occurred. And what is it? What's the economic value point that these university leaders see in the teaching approach that we now have with MOOCs versus the content that we had before? Why is it that they now see some kind of economic value point? Third point that I have issues with MOOCs is we're settling too soon on pedagogies that actually aren't good. We're normalizing to the edX or Coursera models. We don't have a diverse enough experimentation. I mean, there's a dead zone of MOOC activity in certain parts of the world where I'd love to be able to take a MOOC from some of these regions, but I can't because right now we're treating MOOCs as a net export to those areas rather than exporting from those areas. And the other thing that I think is quite a concern is this notion of revenue model, because that's a big area of concern. It's a number of times I get that question, and I'm sure many of you do as well when you chat about MOOCs or otherwise. It's significant. And I have to be honest, is I really don't care about a MOOC revenue model because in my eyes, a MOOC is an experiment. It's a public experiment. It is an opportunity for the university to restate its relevance to society if it's done well. It's a pushback in some ways to the for-profit online education sector that has made inroads in education. So there's a lot that MOOCs can do that quite well, potentially. But the question is revenue, and it's a big focus. And the moment we have somebody that says, here's a revenue model, even limited innovation that we have will halt because we'll begin to serve that revenue model. Just like Google has largely halted innovation in pursuing and structuring its ad-based revenue model. Everything drives, product development and so on, drive decisions around revenue models in Google that focus on that particular model. So that's a similar challenge. Next point is I really couldn't care less about dropout rates. Dropout rates in the MOOCs are totally irrelevant because at the end of the day, let's say I go to Stanford and I've got to leave my home and apart from my family and my dog. And so I go to Stanford, I pay a whack in tuition, I've got a new apartment, and I'd fail. I mean, the emotional, economic, and psychological cost of that failure are stunning. If I drop out of a MOOC, it meant I clicked a button, right? And so it's not a big freaking issue. But for some reason, people seem to think it is. It's a totally irrelevant question. And partly, we're missing the opportunity to treat this as an experiment. When you're in the middle of an experimental process, you shouldn't be thinking about revenue and those kinds of factors because what you're trying to do is understand a so far unknown phenomena, and everything you're doing should be to better understand it outside of those implementation constraints. And the other challenge is that we're still trying to define this potentially emerging system of online distributed network learning by the metrics of an existing education model. And finally, on this regard, it's that MOOCs are disconnected. The MOOC providers are disconnected from what's already known in the research community. When I hear the rhetoric that comes out of we're discovering new pedagogies every day with different MOOC providers, almost any of those pedagogies you can trace to, oh, this was academic research, I don't know, from 1960s, or Bandura said this, and we had Vygotsky who said that, and Engstrom said that. I mean, these aren't novel discoveries. What they're really doing is, hiking over an area that people haven't bothered to fully label the way that they like to see things fully labeled. But so the pedagogical foundation, I'll give Coursera credit. They list what their pedagogical assumptions are. They do a great job of digging up research that serves the particular model that they have. completely ignored is a lot of the emphasis on the social, the generative aspect of knowledge in the learning process. So everything here is around something that reflects duplication. Peer assessment is about as close as they get in this regard. So I'd love to see initiatives like Coursera that start to pay attention to the research around social learning, network learning, the work of Carl Brider, Marlene Scardmalia around knowledge as a generative process. So there's a lot of activity there that needs to go beyond looking. All of these elements, these research focal points, these pedagogical foundations support the Coursera business model. What I'd love to see is somebody support the learning business model to a greater degree that accounts for social and generative aspects. Okay, a little bit of hope, and we'll get down to questions. So one of the things that I think is fairly notable aspect is that, in education, we are witnessing largely an unbundling of the existing education sector. So networks are power. Networks lock in structures, who you include and who you exclude. If you have power of that network, iTunes knows this, Google Play Store knows this, Facebook knows this. So if you have the ability to include and exclude others, you have a power structure where you can bend people to the values that you hold. And that's what we're seeing now. Education previously, that power structure was that end-to-end experience of enroll, teach, assess, accredit, and so on. So that is being unbundled now to a large degree. And we're at the early stages of potentially new rebundling occurring. So another way to look at it is we've spent over a decade pulling apart the pieces of education, and now we're trying to stitch it back together in a way that holds varying ideals. Certain for-profit or Mooc providers would like to stitch it together in a way that serves potential business models. I'm assuming most folks in this room would like to stitch it together in a way that enables quality of learning and access to as many learners as possible. So while we can make fun of Moocs all we want, they are a keystone concept in reformulating education models, because they play at both the teaching and the accreditation aspect of it. And so in some level, we see an education marketplace where everything from the administration to the teaching and learning to content development to assessment is being potentially outsourced by different companies or different organizations, meaning that the university is no longer a self-contained integrated ecosystem. It is now becoming a fragmented ecosystem, and in the next 5+ years, we will start to see those, probably closer to 10 years, we'll start to see those systems re-harden with a new value layer in place, and that value layer, as I mentioned, is really, it's a continuum, but it really sits at the end of the Mooc providers coming on now that want to create a particular, or the for-profit revenue model versus the ideals that I would like to advocate for learning that focus on creativity and knowledge generation. But this landscape, it's not set. So it's not that it'll go 100% to our future is going to be peer or auto-graded learning activities, duplication of lectures. It's not that the future is that set or established. But I think it's silly of us to not at least take a bit of stock and say, look, there's over 7 million people that are at least taking or have signed up for Moocs. On a small side note, it's worth emphasizing there's over 21 million people taking distance education courses, but do we get media? No. There's also been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested in the Mooc phenomenon. There's a growing number of faculty that are involved. The media exposure is significant. So my argument is you can hate on Moocs all you want, but and Moocs aren't the trend, right? It's important to also emphasize Moocs are an instantiation of the trends that have been going on in society that I referenced earlier. They're a reflection of that. Moocs as an acronym, let's pretend it dies in a year and a half's time. That will change nothing about the landscape. It will change nothing about the pressure on the faculty or about the cost reduction pressure. So Moocs, you can, for now, so I guess my argument is, all right, let's just agree we hate Moocs. Point two, let's also recognize that Moocs are an important opportunity for us to exert influence on reshaping the education structure. The best time to change a system is when that system is already in flux. So now that you have a variety of these pieces in flux, it's a great opportunity for us to begin to take more of a knowledge generative view of it and use those fissures that are emerging now in various aspects of the education sector to be able to draw and create a system that better reflects some of the ideals, something that is more networked, something that is more focused on the individual learner, something that emphasizes creativity and generation, essentially something that involves everybody in the room here rather than sitting in a corner. So next time, I guess my argument would be next time you sit there and you want to vent about Coursera or edX or Udacity, it might be a good opportunity to take that energy and focus it on what can I do through an open lens that is valuable rather than pushing against. I did one of these spiritual retreat years ago. I'm not Catholic, but I hung out with this Catholic priest. And so it was a 3-day silent retreat. And so for 3 days, I just shut up. And, the first day is you fidget and twitch quite a bit. But by day 2, day 3, if I wouldn't have been married, I don't think I would have left the area. I mean, really, it was so peaceful. I was in Winnipeg at the time. I get into a car. It's snowing. The taxi driver, and I mean, there's a little aura of happiness about me. And this guy's driving, honking, F you, swearing at everybody. It was quite a shock, but I just thought I'd share that with you. So the point that the priest made to me, that's where I was going. His point was, don't move away from things. Because if you move away from things, you don't have a clue where you're going to end up. Instead, move towards something. So next time you got your hate on for Coursera, I'd encourage you to reflect on what is the vision that I could better use my energy for that more positively reflects the kinds of ideals and values I'd like to see reflected in society. So on that note, I think we're open for questions. Was a gentleman there before, or did the question die?
Well, it didn't die yet, but it's a small question, sort of just fine-tuning definitions kind of thing. The community college is the university. Okay.
Yeah, the community college, I mean, there's a lot of overlap there. I think in many ways, community colleges do a far better job of serving at-risk students than do traditional universities. So it's really about... if I would have known that's all I do for applause, I would have said it right up front. But it's also true. But yes. Okay. Question over there, then over there. Yep.
So more of your comments on a thought. So you said earlier about MOOCs not teaching the skills that are necessary. So I was thinking about the continents that are less served by MOOCs currently. So if you look at, say, Kenya or other African countries where people will do 1 or 2 MOOCs, but their context is so far removed from the context that professors live in that create these MOOC courses, that the course is so disconnected from their real world that I think, I just don't know, maybe you should tell me I'm an idiot and I should stop. But
No, it's okay. Keep going.
there's relevance there that it's so disconnected and their needs are so different that they are using it to solve problems that the course was never intended to provide information for or that. And so I think there's a lot of creativity there. Is anybody looking at that? Is that completely...
Yeah, I'm just trying to see. So what is your question? I just want to make sure I get the question.
So I more want to know if anyone's looking at the context for which the course was originally intended versus the context of the students in which it's applied, and whether that affects how creative the learning process is for the learners.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know of any research that's targeting that right now. It certainly is an interesting question. The other thing is university or students in particular. So, and this is why I think there's a lot of value for MOOCs. I've chatted with students in developing parts of the world, and for them, the ability to have access to certain quality of instruction is significant. So, a part of me, sometimes I like to sit there and have a delicate ego and reflect on, MOOCs have changed from what they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be more integrated, interactive, and so on. But then when you meet a group of students who, for them, this was a quality of learning experience that really changed their life, I kind of have to let my ego go and say, you know what, ultimately it's the learner that's most consequential in defining what's relevant to them. And so that's something that, Coursera and edX and other systems actually do very well. They give learners an opportunity for access that they haven't had in the past. Unfortunately, the openness aspect isn't there. If it's open, you can create it into a new context. If it's not open, the best you can do is what Andrew referenced earlier, which is, well, you can translate it into your own language. Well, I don't want to. I want to change it completely into my own context, and that's different. Yes, there?
Other than DS 106, which is a fantastic example, have you run into other examples of online courses that begin to approach some of the ideals and principles you're talking about?
Well, I think there's many, and many of them don't get the recognition, right? Because our society sometimes is such that unless you say really outrageous, provocative things, you don't get necessarily airplay. So if I was to say, I'm going to do a MOOC that's going to teach you how to think critically and understand a subject deeply, and it'll be informative, and it'll help you have higher quality understanding of a subject area and better relationships, that's hard to get in the press. But if I say, we're going to have 10 universities in 50 years. Boom, there you go, you got press play. So there's this challenge of the nuance that's an issue. And so DS-106, some of the MOOCs that I've been involved with, I'd like to think have a generative focus as well. I have no doubt that a variety of MOOCs that participants in this room have run, that maybe instead of having 5,000 or 100,000 students had 200 or 500 that have had a significant impact. There are systems, let's say Instructure has run, I've run several with Instructure, but there's others that have used the system as well for teaching MOOCs. So I think that's a bit of the issue, is that to date, Coursera, the big thing that Andrew started off with as well is, look how awesome we are. We have the world's elite universities. And in my eyes, I would like to say, to me, awesome would be a distributed, structured network that doesn't rely on relationships and identity that's already established, but rather than ongoing sustaining contributions. And I think those are the kinds of MOOCs that are harder to come by. They're almost more like a boutique kind of a format. So, but no doubt, as you go through the conference the next couple of days, you'll see a lot of examples that address that. 3 minutes? It says 4 on my clock here. Okay, there was a hand over here. Anybody randomly stand up? Yes.
At institutions where they've been doing genuinely open online learning for quite a while, MOOCs are coming along and they're like the new puppy at Christmas. What advice would you give to the old, sworn, faithful, loyal Irish citizens?
I would say just biologically re-engineer yourself into a MOOC chihuahua, personally. But no, I think that existing systems, this is the argument I tried to make somewhat clumsily, but that those systems, you can't die on your sword of how awesome and how true I am to my ideals. I guess if you want to, you can, but it might not have the impact that you want. There's a unique opportunity for the education sector now to take advantage of the unsettledness generated by MOOCs to fashion a vision of learning that they haven't been able to fashion in the past when the system was more static and more tightly integrated. So I would say to those folks is, get with it. I mean, look at what's happening here, engage in what's happening here, treat this as a research landscape rather than something to whine about when you're feeling lonely and sad. Jeff.
Yeah, I noticed that on, I haven't really looked at it, but when you had a slide there on some of the research that was funded by the Gates Foundation, it looked like the majority of that research went to the Coursera Foundation. And I find it interesting that there's in the research, there's the focus on things like the Ivy League colleges, the big corporations, and it's hard to get research money for small institutions doing small projects that may make a bigger difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did have a few grants that were not, now these didn't go to Coursera, the dollars. So they went to, let's say if there was a university that had access to Coursera data for a MOOC that they had run, that would possibly be used. We did have several grants that were successful that were not affiliated with any of those. I think we had 5 or 6 that were unaffiliated with any of the major MOOC providers. So proportionately to press and so on, that's not a bad number. But the other aspect is that in a lot of those systems, so for researchers, when you suddenly have a new research landscape, it's actually kind of exciting. So if you're with Penn State or you're with Duke University and all of a sudden you see this MOOC data that's sitting there, a lot of cases this is data that you haven't had access to in the past. So it's a good opportunity to dive in. But I do agree, and that may be something, and certainly recommendations going back to the Gates Foundation once this particular grant is done, is to start recommending, are there ways in which to target those activities that are outside of mainstream MOOCs but may well have a bigger impact, especially on students that are outside of the education system currently or being ignored. Okay, one more question. Let's say this side of the room, just randomly. Anybody? Yes.
You mentioned, if in a year and a half MOOCs are dead, we'll still be left with this same landscape that we're left with now, the same need that we're left with now. So I'm an instructional designer at the University of Saskatchewan. What are some of the things that you recommend we sort of do while we sit and wait for administrators to shut up about MOOCs?
I really think it is an opportunity for leverage, and I maybe need to get up to speed on my judo or my Zen quotes, but, it's really about use the momentum of MOOCs to help advance the causes that are important to you. So if they're talking about MOOCs, it's hard to educate administrators. So if they're talking about MOOCs, go with it, but bring in your ideas and your values that are reflective of it. On the other hand, if you want to have that fight, go ahead, but I suspect you'll have more success if you use the momentum of MOOCs to achieve the causes that you are particularly concerned about.